My friend S and I got stoned the other day, and we realized how much we wanted to try marijuana with nitrous oxide. So the next day, my friend looked for whippets, but he couldn't find any, so he just bought some whipped cream. Before we were stoned, I inhaled some, and I felt a very subtle change. I felt like I was floating and slightly euphoric. I enjoyed the small and short, about a half-minute trip. Having already run out of nitrous, S went and got 2 cans of whipped cream and came back to my place. We took turns hitting my bong for 10 minutes or so. My friend wanted to keep hitting the bong, which in hindsight was a much better idea, but I remembered the nitrous and decided it was time to try my first combination out. I put on a song that had special meaning to me and sat down on this little couch in my room. As my friend sat back and watched, I took the biggest lungful of nitrous that was possible. It went down relatively easy compared to the marijuana smoke. It was cool and light. I stopped and I held it in as long as possible. I remember I was just sitting on my couch, not moving at all because I thought the effects would already begin affecting me. Then S said, "You did it, man," and I looked at him. As my head turned, my body was suddenly dropped into oblivion. I got an uncomfortable feeling that I was in a different place. I was looking at my room, sitting on my couch, but somehow, everything had completely changed. It felt as though my mind had suddenly invented a couple of new senses, and through each one I was getting so much information that I was left comatose in these surges of fear. I tried to relax, to tell myself that this was only a bad trip and it would end soon, but my body wouldn't let me go. I never had such a bad trip in my entire life. I got up and began pacing back and forth. S was staring at me, and I could see the look on his face that he was unsure whether I was tripping really hard or just anxious. He asked me what was up, and I realized that there was no point in stressing my bad trip. I had a friend who always claimed to have experienced the worst trip possible, but few felt sympathy because it was hard to tell whether he actually had such a bad trip, or if he just couldn't handle the effects of our extremely dank marijuana. I really didn't feel like dealing with my friend S trying to help me out, because I can assure you, nothing anybody could ever do would pull me out of what I was going through. It was like I was thrown into a world of cold, surreal despair, where reality wasn't what I saw and interpreted, but how I felt, and that I had suddenly become aware of what reality truly is. I felt so utterly doomed, and I tried to tell myself repeatedly that it was only a bad trip and that it would end, and I knew so, but I was constantly reevaluating the situation and coming to the conclusion that I would never be the same again. I began to miss the way I felt before I took the nitrous. I remembered my pleasantly stoned self. Compared to what I was experiencing at the time before I'd taken nitrous was heaven. I wished so hard that I could just return to that feeling, but it was impossible. I remembered that nitrous generally lasts only about a half a minute, but this feeling of total fear hadn't left. I started to wonder if this was actually what I was supposed to be feeling, or if I had my own unique reaction to nitrous and cannabis. My friend S decided to inhale his nitrous at this point, and I gave him a thorough warning on how different a feeling it was, and that it may be too powerful for him. I asked him to consider the consequences of 2 friends having equally bad trips. At first, I scared him out of doing it, but after my attention switched back to my horrible trip, I heard the release of nitrous and I saw my friend with the can in his mouth. In part, I didn't care anymore. All of my senses were destroyed. I felt as though I was swimming in a massive sea of needles. I found that trying as hard as I could to control the trip took away some of my attention from how cruel it really was. It was like the effects of the trip were riding me around in the saddle. To push the fear away, I had to try to trip myself out intentionally. In this sense, although I was still tripping just as hard and just as horribly, it was in a way my will to trip that hard, and I just felt insane instead of doomed. It was like riding myself with the saddle. I came close to tears at one point because of how much I missed just being simply stoned. My friend S didn't seem to be doing that badly with his nitrous. He took 2 hits and he was nowhere as bad as I was. He tried to help me trip out on optical illusions on my computer, but they only made me feel more nauseous. I turned the music off. It was really beginning to make my trip worse. It was like all of my senses were storing everything in my mind, so as I stored more, things just got louder and brighter and heavier on me. I was absolutely exhausted by this point. Constantly trying to dominate my bad trip was such a mental workout. I grew so tired I couldn't think of anything but how badly I wanted it to stop. I finally decided that I had to try to go to sleep. I went to take off my contacts, and this was very painstakingly cruel. After I took off my contacts, I was worried that I scratched my cornea or something, and for the rest of my life I would have this scar in my sight that would forever remind me of this trip. I tried to relax and crawled off to bed. I sleep on top of a bunk bed, and I must say, this was truly the most sickening experience of my life. If I laid on my back, I felt like I was falling at an incredible speed and there was nothing that could stop me. But when I laid on my chest, I was alright, but my head felt horrible. I tried to comfort myself with thoughts of waking up the next morning and being alright, and getting just plain old stoned again for the next hour. Sleep was nearly impossible. I woke up today and I still felt stoned. I got really worried. I lay in bed as long as possible and tried to get some sleep. Eventually I leaned up and I realized that for the most part my feeling of stonedness was a result of not moving. I got up and took a shower. I felt very weird. I still feel weird right now. I can definitely say that my experience with cannabis and nitrous oxide was a most unpleasant one. I can't put into words how horrible this trip was. I can imagine cruel despots using this as a form of torture. I was in hell, truly. I would suggest not trying this combination. Even though it may have been an isolated incident, I fear for you if you wish to try it. I may be alright with inhaling nitrous alone, but never again with any other psychoactive substance. My fantasies about drug combinations have been killed. I would never wish that experience upon anybody, not even my arch enemy. I now have fears that when I smoke pot again, it will trigger a relapse. I still have the whipped cream cans in my room, and somehow I have grown intense hatred for them. I'll tell you one thing those cans are good for: whipped cream. That's it. Last year, a few friends and I scored an awesome summertime job at an old-fashioned ice cream parlor. We had applied because of the many prospective benefits the job offered: working with friends, getting tips, and of course, free ice cream. Once we began working, however, we discovered an additional advantage that we hadn't counted on: whipped cream cans. Lots of whipped cream cans. I had never tried nitrous before. It had always seemed kind of childish to me compared to acid or shrooms, but my friend Tina reassured me that the high would only last a few seconds, and after hearing her talk about the effects, I agreed to try it. So after closing that first night, Tina and I each snuck a full can into the bathroom and huffed together. At first, I felt nothing, and I started to cross my eyes at Tina to tell her how stupid I thought we were being, and then it hit me. Tingling, numbing sensation shot up and down my entire body, and I was hit by an incredible rush of the most intense euphoria I have ever experienced. My vision began to blur and black dots danced madly before my eyes. The intensity quickly peaked, at which point my vision went completely black and my body completely numb. The rush then subsided as quickly as it had come. It truly only lasted 10 or 15 seconds. The euphoria lasted an additional 15 minutes or so. We couldn't stop laughing as we were cleaning up. I instantly loved it, but was worried about killing off my brain cells. But Tina claimed that nitrous was a safe drug because it supposedly didn't last long enough to cause any damage. So we decided to share our experience with our other friends, and the whipped cream spread like an epidemic. Before long, almost everybody who worked there, mostly high school kids like us, was huffing nitrous all the time. The dangers began when we discovered that we could put 2 cans in our mouth and huff them both at the same time. This was extremely fun, but we didn't do it very often because we were afraid that the boss would notice how many cans were missing. So most of the time we settled for 1 can each per night. One night, however, our boss was exhausted and went home early, leaving me and Tina, our coworker Rebecca, and our manager Kevin to close up the store. Kevin went outside to take a cigarette break, and Tina took 4 cans of whipped cream out of the fridge, 2 for me and 2 for her. Rebecca is straight edge, but she's open-minded and doesn't care if we do things in front of her. I had a really bad headache that day, so I told Tina that I didn't want to huff. At first she looked disappointed, but then she grinned and said, "Well, I'll just do some cans for both of you guys," and took out 2 more cans. That's when things got really scary. Rebecca and I watched as Tina lined up all 6 cans on the counter and proceeded to huff them 2 by 2. As she finished off the last 2, she smiled up at us and started to say something. All of a sudden, her face went ashen and she started shaking violently. Rebecca and I were both alarmed and kept asking her if she was okay, and she fell to the floor, her entire body going still. It wasn't exactly like she had passed out. She was just sitting down on the floor, huddled up in a ball and not moving, her eyes wide and horrified, staring at nothing. I panicked and didn't know what to do, so I just stood there looking down at her, scared to death that she was going to faint and maybe die. Her eyes suddenly closed and her lips started to turn bright blue. At this point, Rebecca ran to the phone and started to dial 911, but before she did, I saw Tina's eyes open and her body relax. I helped her stand up, but she was incredibly shaken and had to hold onto the counter to keep herself upright. Later, Tina told us that things had just gotten way too intense and that she'd had a sudden and unexpected out-of-body experience, but she wouldn't say anything more about it. From my perspective, she had simply collapsed and stopped breathing. Tina didn't touch another can for the remainder of the summer. I still occasionally would with other friends, but never more than one at a time, and never without remembering the sickening image of Tina's bright blue, suffocating lips. Please, if you're going to do nitrous or any other substance for that matter, be careful. Yes, it can be fun, but as we've all heard, too much of a good thing can be disastrous. No drug is safe in excess or if it is taken to an extreme. Your body and your mind have limits, obey them. Peace and happy tripping. Last night I had a terrible experience with nitrous oxide. I had just been playing Crisis 3 and was on my third beer, kept losing to a boss. I got bored of it and decided I might have a few bulbs. I've recently started to see very slight visuals when on nitrous oxide with my eyes closed, only faint flashes and one time a small psychedelic pattern in the center of my vision. Anyway, I paused the game. There was some slightly unnerving music from the pause menu. I lay down on the couch and did 3 or 4 bulbs with no issue, saw some very minor visuals, was pleased with the results, so I decided to keep going. On the 5th bulb, something weird started happening. I got these pink outlines very faintly appearing. Eventually, they turned into outlines of what looked like a devil dancing. They all looked identical, like neon sign outlines, all in 2D, kind of like looking at a sheet of glowing pink stickers. I opened my eyes and exclaimed, "What the fuck?" and laughed it off as looking kinda like a devil. The outlines were still able to be made out when my eyes were open, but faded quickly. Stupidly, I decided to do another one. This time, I decided the music on the pause menu was not good with nitrous, so I turned it off and opted for silence. This time I did the same thing, lay on the couch with eyes closed. Rather quickly, I began to see red outlines of a demon's face, like a stereotypical devil cartoon, and it looked like it was laughing, again in 2D like a neon sign. About 20 of them all next to each other, again as if a huge glowing sheet of stickers was all I could see. This was accompanied by a feeling of dread that I could almost hear. As soon as I began to see the faces appear, I ditched the balloon and exclaimed, "Fuck this shit," and got up feeling quite shaken up. It was the first time I've ever visually hallucinated something and really scared me. I've been doing nitrous oxide on and off for about 5 years and would call myself a highly experienced user. This is not something I saw coming at all. After this, I put on some happy music and tried again, focused on thoughts of love, family, nice things, no reappearance. This morning I tackled another box of bulbs, the last one I had, to see if anything similar would happen. Nothing else did. I think it's definitely time for me to give these things up. Thanks for listening. I started huffing whippets in 2006, the year I turned 30. What started as a weekend habit turned into much more, and I soon began huffing 1 to 4 boxes of chargers, 24 chargers per box, in the space of 1 to 2 hours per sitting. At first, I would get really nauseous as I got close to finishing 1 box, but over time, I developed a tolerance. The high felt good. There are plenty of other well-written trip reports describing how the high feels, so I won't go into that so much. One thing I did note after using nitrous for about a year is that there's a short-term mental high, and then there's a low-level body high that develops after the first box and lasted for about 10 to 15 minutes after I stopped. I continued huffing nitrous at least a couple times a week, and after about 2.5 years, I started developing extreme fatigue, clumsiness, and a loss of sensation in my extremities. The loss of feeling in my feet and hands and the fatigue kept getting worse and worse as I went from blood test after blood test and neurologist and nerve conduction study to MRI after MRI. It was clear that I had multiple neuropathies, loss of electrical signal from the brain to my hands and feet, and if it wasn't developing so slowly it would have resembled a deadly Guillain-Barré syndrome or Parkinson's or severe MS to a T, but it was happening slowly. Finally, my neurologist ordered a functional MRI of my neck, C-spine, and that's where they found the problem. A severe vitamin B12 deficiency in my tissues had caused at least 8 lesions on my spinal cord, where the myelin sheath that insulates the spinal cord so that it doesn't lose electrical signal had worn away at the points where rubbed against the insides of my vertebrae. That's when I realized it was the nitrous that had caused the problem all along. According to almost 100 years of medical research that I read, the literature unanimously stated that nitrous oxide use depletes vitamin B12 from the body and sucks it out of tissues if it isn't available in the bloodstream. Even if the B12 gets replaced within a day or few, as it did in my case, that short-term loss of B12 means that during the period of deficiency, the nerves in my body were not able to repair the myelin sheaths around my spine and all of my neurons. I stopped doing nitrous altogether, and over the next few months I stopped needing to sleep 20 plus hours every day, stopped needing a walker to keep from falling, and regained about 90% of the feeling in my hands and about 70% of the feeling in my feet. I have permanent partial sock numbness because of my nitrous use during that time, but there was other damage that could not be repaired. I had to drop out of school in an undergrad program at a local university that is highly competitive and impossible to finish unless I somehow both managed to convince them to let me back into the program and take away another candidate's slot, and then I'd have to start over from scratch and take the whole 2 years over again in order to finish. I have permanent working memory, long-term memory, and cognitive impairments from the damage it did to my brain. Whoever says that nitrous isn't a hard drug and that it's not addictive, they don't know what they're talking about. It's as addictive as crack cocaine is, at least for me, which is the drug that I ended up getting addicted to next, to replace the previous addiction of nitrous oxide. There are several very good reasons that many people call nitrous hippie crack.